The air in the pre-assessment chamber was a manufactured nullity. It carried no scent, no temperature, no memory. It was designed to be forgotten, a sterile membrane between the regulated calm of the dormitories and the clinical finality of the Concordance's grand theater. Elian felt it not as an absence, but as a pressure, a smothering weight against his skin, in his lungs. He sat on the edge of a polished chrome steel bench, the cold of it seeping through the thin, white fabric of his tunic. His hands were laced together in his lap, the knuckles white. He was a cartographer of silent things, and this room was a vast, uncharted desert of sensory deprivation. It was a place designed to quiet the mind, but for him, it only made the internal noise louder. The hum was the worst part. Not the audible mechanical thrum of the facility's life support systems, but the psychic static of the other candidates waiting in identical chambers down the long white corridor, a low, persistent murmur of anxiety, of ambition, of carefully curated hope. It was a chorus of dissonant whispers against the fragile walls of his consciousness. He was subject 734, a resonant, an empath in the archaic terminology. To the Concordance, he was a delicate instrument, a finely tuned sensor package whose purpose was to detect and affirm the deep, genetic and psychic compatibilities that formed the bedrock of their ordered society. He did not feel like an instrument. He felt like an open wound. Every glance, every stray thought from a passing orderly, every flicker of the recessed lumen panels above was a grain of salt ground into that wound. He closed his eyes, focusing on the rhythm of his own breathing, a desperate attempt to build a fortress from the inside out. Inhale, the cold, dead air. Exhale, a ghost of warmth. It was a meager defense. Then it came, a silence within the noise. It was not a void like the room, but a presence, a gravity so immense it bent the psychic chatter around it, pulling it into a silent, inescapable orbit. It was a presence he had felt before, a shadow in the periphery of his awareness, a flicker of absolute stillness in the bustling corridors of the Institute. He had never seen its source, not truly, but he knew its texture. It was like cold, black iron. It was the feeling of a perfectly honed weapon resting in its sheath, utterly still yet pregnant with a terrible potential for violence. It was control, absolute and unyielding. The presence drew closer and Elian's breath hitched. The air in his chamber seemed to thin, to grow colder. It was not a hostile force, not in the way a guard's suspicion was hostile. It was something deeper, more fundamental. It was a recognition, a low, resonant hum that vibrated not in his ears but in the marrow of his bones. His mind, so accustomed to the chaotic sea of others' emotions, suddenly found a focal point, an anchor in the storm. The feeling was terrifying, and it was exquisite. A soft chime echoed through the room, the signal to proceed. He rose, his legs unsteady. The door slid open with a sigh of pneumatics, revealing another white corridor, this one leading directly to the assessment theater. The gravity he felt, that immense, silent presence, was waiting there. He knew it. He walked toward it, a moth drawn not to a flame, but to a perfect, beautiful darkness. The theater was a circle of white stone and frosted glass, an amphitheater of judgment. Tiered seats held a select audience of administrators and geneticists, their faces impassive, their thoughts shielded, disciplined. In the center of the floor, under a halo of diagnostic light, stood a single figure. He was tall, built with a lean, efficient grace that spoke of relentless training. His uniform was the severe black of an executor, the highest echelon of the Concordance's security and enforcement arm. His hair was the color of ash, cut short and severe. His face was a study in planes and angles, handsome in a way that was almost cruel, as if sculpted from ice. But Elian saw none of that, not at first. He only felt. The silent gravity now had a source. It poured from the man in waves, a palpable aura of discipline and containment. His name, Elian knew from the pre-assessment data slate, was Kale. Executor Kale. He was not a candidate. He was part of the assessment itself, a benchmark, a control variable of the highest order, their most stable, most formidable asset. Elian was instructed to take his place on a designated mark opposite Kyle. The air between them crackled. The diagnostic light intensified, and the hum of the monitoring equipment deepened. Elian felt the familiar invasive probe of the psychic sensors, mapping his neural pathways, gauging his emotional state. But they were background noise. The only signal that mattered was the one standing 10 feet away. Kale's eyes, the color of a winter storm, met his, and for the first time the silence was broken. A connection, sharp and sudden as a lightning strike, arced between them. It was not a thought. It was not an emotion. It was a torrent. A lifetime of discipline, a will of forged steel, a core of profound, aching loneliness hidden beneath 1,000 layers of ice. Elian gasped, his knees threatening to buckle under the sudden, overwhelming intimacy of it. He was drowning in Kyle, and Kale, he could feel, was drowning in him. For a single infinite second, the executor's mask of control shattered. Elian saw it in the fractional widening of his eyes, the tightening of his jaw. He felt the shock, the raw, unadulterated panic that ripped through that ironclad mind. A variance, an anomaly, a feeling where none should exist. The system around them screamed in silent digital ecstasy. The resonance metric on the main screen began to climb, the numbers flickering from green to amber, then to a blaring, unprecedented crimson. A perfect match, a 100% psychic resonance. It was impossible. It was a miracle. It was a death sentence. The crimson light bathed the assessment theater in a bloody glow, the numerical display beside it locked at a perfect, impossible score. The murmur from the tiered seats ceased, replaced by a collective, indrawn breath. The silence was absolute, a vacuum waiting for judgment. For Elian, the world had collapsed into the space between himself and the man before him. The flood of Kyle's inner self, the discipline, the loneliness, the sudden, violent shock was still echoing through him, a phantom limb he could suddenly feel. He saw the universe of control Kale had built around himself, and he had, by his very existence, become the earthquake that threatened to bring it all down. He looked at Kale, his own raw, hopeful, terrified soul open for the other man to see. It was a plea. See me, acknowledge this. Kale's face, which had for a fleeting moment betrayed a human response, became a mask once more. The ice reformed, thicker and more impenetrable than before. His storm-gray eyes became flat, polished stones, reflecting the clinical light but revealing nothing. The connection between them did not sever. It was too strong for that. A physical thing now, a filament of light only they could perceive, but he walled it off, brick by painful brick, encasing it in a tomb of pure will. Elian felt the rejection as a physical blow, a sudden, brutal coldness that made him recoil. The warmth of that impossible connection vanished, leaving an ache that was sharper than any pain the concordance's doctors could devise. The head of the assessment panel, a severe woman with silver hair pulled into a tight knot, was Overseer Auris Thorne. Her voice, amplified by the theater's acoustics, was as sterile as the air. Executor Kale, your analysis. It was not a question. It was a command. Kale's gaze did not waver from Elian's face. The silence stretched, each second a fresh turn of the knife in Elian's chest. He could feel the war raging behind those stone-gray eyes, the instinct, the resonance, fighting against a lifetime of conditioning, the truth against the necessary lie. Elian held his breath, a foolish, fragile hope fluttering in his throat. Then Kyle spoke. His voice was exactly as Elian had imagined it would feel. Cold, precise, and utterly devoid of emotion. It cut through the silence of the theater like a scalpel. The resonance is a null sequence, he stated, each word a perfectly formed shard of glass, a psychic aberration. The subject's empathic sensitivity is creating a feedback loop, projecting a false positive by mirroring my own systemic stability. He did not look away from Elian as he said it. He wanted Elian to see the lie as he delivered it. He wanted him to understand the finality of it. A null sequence, an aberration, a false positive. The words were not just a denial, they were an erasure. They declared Elian not just incompatible, but defective. His gift was a EA malfunction. His very nature was a lie. The crimson display on the screen was dismissed as an error in the machine, and he was the ghost causing it. The hushed whispers started in the stands, a new kind of psychic static. Pity, disdain, clinical curiosity. He was no longer a promising candidate. He was a broken instrument, a fascinating failure to be dissected. The shame was a physical heat that spread from his chest to his face, his neck, his fingertips. He wanted the floor to swallow him. He wanted to cease to exist. He looked at Cale one last time, a desperate, silent appeal. Cale's expression was one of absolute, chilling indifference. He turned with military precision and walked away, leaving Elian alone in the center of the room, pinned by the light and the weight of 1,000 judgments. Subject 734, Overseer Thorne's voice announced. The tone shifted from inquiry to disposition. You are reclassified as a variance. Report to the recalibration ward for diagnostic and corrective therapy. The words were calm, procedural, but they were a verdict. Recalibration was a euphemism. It was where they sent the broken things to be fixed or, if unfixable, to be dismantled. As two orderlies approached, their faces impassive, their psychic presence smelling of antiseptic and apathy, Elian felt the last of his strength give way. The filament of light that still connected him to Cale, now impossibly distant, pulsed with a single, sharp, undeniable emotion that bled through the executor's iron walls. It was not indifference. It was not disgust. It was a searing, suffocating agony. It was regret. And it was the cruelest cut of all. He did not resist as the orderlies took his arms. He was led from the theater, the ghost of a perfect connection, trailing behind him like a funeral shroud. He was a variance, a broken thing, and the man who broke him had done it to the sound of silent, screaming applause. The corridors of the executor's wing were silent, the air still and cold. The lumen panels overhead cast long, sterile shadows on the polished floor. Cale walked with a measured, even pace, his posture perfect, his hands clasped behind his back. To any observer, he was the image of concordance discipline, an asset returning to his designated function. Inside, a firestorm raged. The echo of the resonance was a phantom limb, an ache in a space he never knew was empty. He could still feel the raw, open purity of Elian's mind touching his, a field of summer grass after a lifetime in a steel room. It was a vulnerability he could not afford, a contamination of the perfect, sterile order of his existence. He was not a man. He was an executor, a tool forged to maintain the system. And that tool had just been exposed to a force that threatened to shatter it. He reached his quarters, the door sliding open to a room as Spartan and controlled as he was. A bed, a desk, a terminal, no personal effects, no sentiment. He stood in the center of the room, the silence pressing in. The rejection had been a necessary amputation. An unprecedented resonance score would have made them a target. Not a celebrated pair, but a project. A weapon to be refined, a bond to be weaponized by Overseer Thorne and her cadre of researchers. They would have been put in a cage of observation, their every interaction dissected, their minds flayed open for science. Kale would have become the keeper and Elian the prisoner. A different kind of death. His lie, his cold public cruelty, had been an act of preservation. He had branded Elian a variance to make him seem worthless, a broken piece of equipment to be shelved and forgotten, a miscalculation. He had not anticipated the recalibration ward. He had sought to hide Elian in plain sight and instead had delivered him into the hands of the system's most brutal mechanics. Protect. The thought was not his own. It was a primal, intrusive command that rose from the deepest part of his being, from the part the Concordance's conditioning had never managed to touch. It was the instinct that had screamed in protest when he spoke the lie in the theater. It was the instinct that now coiled in his gut like a serpent. He was not a protector. He was an enforcer of order. The two were mutually exclusive. Yet the feeling persisted. A low, insistent hum beneath the surface of his training. He went to his terminal, the screen flickering to life. With a few swift, encrypted commands, he accessed the facility's internal surveillance network. He was not authorized for this level of observation, but his clearance codes were high enough to bypass the lower-level security protocols. He found the recalibration ward, Sector Gamma. He brought up the feed for Medical Bay 3. The image was stark, rendered in the cold, blue-white light of the ward. Elian was strapped to a diagnostic chair, his face pale, his eyes closed. A medic, a thick-set man with an air of bored cruelty, was attaching neural sensors to his temples. Elian flinched as the man's fingers pressed too hard, his touch rough and impatient. Kyle watched, his own hands clenching into fists at his sides. He felt a flicker of Elian's pain, a faint echo of the fear and humiliation through the bruised filament of their connection. The medic activated the machine. A low whine filled the air and Elian's body went rigid, a soft cry escaping his lips. Kyle's vision narrowed. The world outside the monitor faded away. A cold, white-hot rage began to build in his chest. It was not the righteous anger of an executor witnessing a breach of protocol. This was something else, something possessive, something feral. Mine. The medic grunted, making a notation on a datapad. Variance levels remain high, he muttered to himself. Increase the frequency. He reached for the console again. Kale did not think. He did not plan or calculate. His body moved, a singular, fluid motion of purpose. He was out of his quarters and moving through the corridors before he had formed a conscious thought. His pace was not hurried. It was deliberate, lethal. He was the system's perfect weapon, and the system was harming his. He cut the thought off. He did not have a word for what Elian was. He only knew that he had to stop it. He reached the recalibration ward, the guards at the entrance stiffening at the sight of an executor in their sector. He did not acknowledge them. He strode past, his authority an invisible shield. He found Medical Bay 3, the door sliding open before him. The medic looked up, startled, his hand hovering over the console. Elian's head lolled to the side, his consciousness fading. Kale moved to the console and with a single precise motion terminated the sequence. The whining of the machine died. Report. Kale's voice was low, dangerous. The medic, flustered, rose to his feet. Executor, this is a restricted session. Subject 734 is undergoing. I am aware of the subject's status. Kale cut him off, his gray eyes locking onto the man's. I am countermanding your procedure. There is evidence of procedural contamination. You will be reassigned pending a full review. The medic's face paled. Contamination. Executor, I assure you I followed the protocol. Kyle took one step closer. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. The sheer menace rolling off him was enough. Your emotional state is unregulated. Your handling of the subject was inefficient. You are compromised. Leave. Now. The man practically scrambled from the room. Kyle was left alone with Elian. He looked at the pale, unconscious figure in the chair. The raw, protective instinct that had driven him here receded, leaving him cold and exposed. What had he done? He had just drawn a massive red flag around himself and Elian. He had confirmed the very connection he had sought to deny. He reached out, his gloved fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before deactivating the restraints on Elian's wrists. He did not touch him. He could not allow himself that. He turned and left the bay, melting back into the sterile white corridors, the echo of his own irrationality a damning indictment. He was not a protector. He was a fool. And he was terrified of what that instinct would make him do next. The world returned in fragments. The sting of antiseptic in his nostrils, the dull ache behind his eyes, the rough texture of the medical gown against his skin. Elian drifted back to consciousness slowly, as if surfacing from a deep, dark body of water. The last thing he remembered was the whine of the recalibration machine, the rough hands of the medic, and a spike of pain that had threatened to tear his mind apart. But the pain was gone now. The machine was silent. He was alone in the medical bay, the restraints on his wrists hanging loose. He sat up, his body trembling with the aftershocks of the neural treatment. He looked at his arms, at the faint red marks where the straps had been. He should be in agony. He should be a wreck of frayed nerves and psychic burnout. Instead, he felt a strange, hollow quiet. The usual static of the facility was muted, as if someone had thrown a heavy blanket over his senses. In the days that followed, the quiet persisted. His life in the recalibration ward fell into a strange, contradictory rhythm of neglect and invisible intervention. The medic who had treated him so brutally was gone, replaced by a nervous younger orderly who handled him with hesitant, almost fearful care. The nutrient paste they served, usually a bitter, gritty substance, was now inexplicably bland, the unpleasant edge gone. During one transport down a long corridor, a much larger inmate, a hulking man decommissioned from the labor corps for aggression, moved toward him with obvious malice. Before the man could get within 5 feet, 2 guards materialized as if from nowhere, intercepting him and dragging him away for a protocol violation. It was seamless, efficient, and utterly inexplicable. Elian was not a fool. These were not coincidences. He was being watched over. He was being protected. And the protection had a distinct, familiar signature. It was cold. It was precise. It was absolute. It felt like a predator's shadow, a silent hunter circling his cage, not to harm him but to drive all other threats away. It was terrifying. And in the desolate landscape of his new existence, it was the only thing that felt real. He began to feel for it, to search for that presence in the psychic ether of the concordance. It was not the open, overwhelming flood he had felt in the assessment theater. That door was still barred and locked. This was something else, a thin, steady signal from the other side of the wall. A low, constant hum of vigilance. It was Cale. He knew it with a certainty that defied logic. The man who had shattered him in public was now his unseen guardian. The contradiction was a madness that threatened to unravel what little of him was left. One afternoon, while being escorted to a physical therapy session, a pointless exercise in maintaining the health of a body that housed a mind they were trying to dismantle, he saw him. It was just a glimpse. Down a long intersecting corridor, Kyle was standing, speaking to another executor. He was a stark figure in his black uniform against the pervasive white of the walls. For a fraction of a second, as Elian was led past the intersection, Cale's head turned. Their eyes met across the distance. The gaze was not for the other executor, it was for him. It lasted no more than a heartbeat, but the intensity of it was a physical force. It was not hatred. It was not pity. It was a raw, undiluted current of something. A warning, a promise, a cage. The look held the cold fury of a storm, the possessiveness of a king, the desolation of a man utterly alone. Then he was gone, hidden by the angle of the wall, and Elian was left with the ghost of that gaze burned into his mind. That evening, a new visitor came to his cell. Not an orderly, not a medic. Overseer Aris Thorne. She stood on the other side of the transparent partition, her hands clasped behind her back, her expression one of placid academic curiosity. "Subject 734, she said, her voice smooth and calm. "Your recalibration metrics are unusual. Your neural degradation has plateaued. In fact, in some areas, we are seeing signs of recovery. This is an anomaly." Elian said nothing. He sat on his cot watching her, feeling the cold analytical probe of her mind, a scientist studying a peculiar insect. "You have been the recipient of several instances of what might be termed good fortune lately," she continued, a faint, unreadable smile playing on her lips. "Scheduled procedures have been altered, personnel reassigned, unfortunate accidents averted. It would seem you have an admirer." Her eyes, the color of faded slate, held his. "Tell me about your connection to Executor Kyle, Subject 734, the feedback loop you supposedly created. It seems to be far more persistent than his assessment would suggest." The question was a trap, laid with surgical precision. To admit the connection was to confirm Kale's lie and doom them both. To deny it was to lie to the one person in the concordance who likely already knew the truth. Elian met her gaze, and for the first time since the assessment, he did not feel fear. He felt a spark of defiance, fanned into life by the ghost of Kale's protective gaze. He gave her the only answer he could. Silence. Thorne's smile widened slightly. "Very well," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "If the subject will not come to the data, then the data must be brought to the subject. We will try a more direct approach. An integrative therapy session has been scheduled for you, with the executor, tomorrow." She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. Elian was left alone, the name of his tormentor and his savior hanging in the air like a death sentence and a prayer. The observation chamber was a perfect circle of white. The walls were seamless, curving into the floor and ceiling, giving the impression of being inside an egg. Or a bone. There was no furniture, only a single line bisecting the floor. On one side, Elian. On the other, Kale. The only feature was the wall itself, which Elian knew was not a wall at all, but one-way mirrored glass. They were inside a specimen jar, and Overseer Thorne was watching. Kale stood with his back to the wall, his posture rigid, his hands clasped behind him. He was a statue of black granite, a monument to control. The proximity was a physical weight, a pressure in the air that made it hard to breathe. The resonant filament between them, which had been a faint, bruised whisper for weeks, now thrummed with a painful, vibrant energy. It was like standing too close to a power conduit, the air buzzing with contained force. Elian could feel the storm inside Kale, the war between his conditioning and the instinct that had driven him to this room. The instinct to protect was at violent odds with the instinct to flee, to maintain distance. It was a feedback loop of a different kind, and it was tearing the executor apart from the inside. Kale's gaze was fixed on the far wall, pointedly avoiding Elian, but he saw. From the corner of his eye, he saw the faint, bluish bruises on Elian's temple, almost faded, where the neural sensors had been clamped. He saw the way the loose medical gown hung on his frame, the subtle tremor in his hands. Each detail was a fresh indictment of his own failure. His lie was meant to make Elian invisible, and it had only succeeded in making him a target. The rage he felt was a cold, clean thing, a laser of pure fury directed not at the system, that was too vast, too abstract, but at himself. He had done this. He had delivered this fragile, brilliant flame into the hands of a furnace. The silence in the room stretched, thick and suffocating. It was a tactical silence, wielded by Thorn as a weapon to break them down. Elian took a hesitant step forward, his bare feet making no sound on the polished floor. Cale did not move, but Elian felt the jolt of alarm that shot through him, a silent, visceral stay back. Elian stopped. He was terrified. This man was a walking paradox, a source of both his deepest wound and his only safety. The air was thick with Cale's conflict, with his desperate, violent need to maintain control. But beneath it, buried deep, Elian could still feel the echo of that first connection. The loneliness, the ache for something real in a world of artifice. Thorn's voice, disembodied and serene, filled the chamber. The objective of this session is to quantify the anomalous resonance. You will interface. Executor, that is a direct order. The word interface was a clinical obscenity. Kyle's jaw tightened. A direct order. He could not refuse. His body was an instrument of the concordance. It would obey even if his soul rebelled. He turned his head slowly, his storm-gray eyes finally meeting Elian's. The raw agony in them was so profound that Elian felt his own heart crack in sympathy. He saw the executor's hands, hidden behind his back, clench into fists so tight the knuckles must have been white. He was preparing to obey, to force a connection, to profane the one pure thing he had ever encountered. Elian couldn't bear it. He couldn't let Thorn win, couldn't let her turn this into another violation. Acting on an impulse born of desperation, he reached out. Not with his hand, but with his mind. He didn't push, he didn't pry. He simply opened a door inside himself, offering a feeling, a memory. The sensation of sunlight on his face from a childhood before the concordance, a fragment of warmth, of peace, a silent offering. You are not alone. It was the one thing Cale's defenses were not prepared for. Not an attack, but a gift. The offering of warmth struck his internal wall of ice, and a fissure appeared. And through that fissure, the dam of his control broke. He moved. It was not the slow, measured obedience of an executor. It was the explosive, desperate motion of a drowning man reaching for air. He crossed the room in 2 long, silent strides, the line on the floor meaningless. Elian flinched back, expecting a blow, an attack, a final, brutal rejection. Instead, Cale's hand shot out and grabbed his arm, his grip not violent, but a steel band of pure, undiluted desperation. He pulled Elian closer, and before Elian could process what was happening, Cale pressed his forehead against his. The contact was a cataclysm. The psychic wall shattered into a million pieces. It was not a flood. It was a supernova. Every suppressed emotion, every moment of fear, every silent scream of rage and regret Cale had experienced since the assessment day poured into Elian. And Elian's own pain, his loneliness, his terror, and that fragile, stubborn spark of hope flowed back into Cale. It was agony. It was ecstasy. It was a perfect, terrible equilibrium. And through the storm, a single clear thought from Cale, not spoken, not projected, but simply known between them. They are watching. The rejection. It was to hide you. I failed. The admission was a shard of glass, but it was also a key, unlocking a truth that recontextualized everything. He had not been abandoned. He had been protected. Terribly. Inefficiently. But it had been protection all the same. In the sterile white jar of the observation room, under the cold, watchful eye of their tormentor, a fragile, dangerous alliance was forged in a silent, explosive union of minds. The session was terminated immediately. Alarms, soft but insistent, chimed through the chamber. The connection, overwhelming as it was, had to be severed. Cale pulled back as if burned, his face a mask of shock and self-recrimination. He had lost control. In front of the overseer, it was an unforgivable breach of protocol, a failure of his most fundamental conditioning. Two executors entered the chamber, their weapons drawn but not aimed. They flanked Kale, their posture wary as if handling an unstable device. "Executor Kale," one said, his voice flat. "You are to report to Overseer Thorne's office. Immediately." Kale's eyes met Elian's for a final, fleeting moment. The silent communication was still there, a raw, open channel between them. Elian felt Kale's fear, not for himself, but for Elian. He had exposed them completely. He was escorted away, leaving Elian trembling in the center of the room, the phantom sensation of Kale's forehead against his still burning on his skin. Kale stood at attention before Overseer Thorne's desk. The office was a bubble of quiet authority at the heart of the concordance, the air scented with the faint, sterile smell of ozone from the advanced filtration system. Thorne watched him, her fingers steepled, her expression unreadable. He expected decommissioning. He expected reassignment to the harshest frontier post. He expected a full neural recalibration of his own. "Your performance in the observation chamber was illuminating, Executor," Thorne began, her voice deceptively mild. "You disobeyed a direct order to interface only to initiate contact in a far more aggressive and uncontrolled manner. You allowed an emotional response to dictate your actions. By all rights, you should be stripped of your rank and sent for analysis as a variance yourself." Kyle remained silent. His mind was a fortress once more, but it was a fortress with a gaping hole in its walls, a hole shaped exactly like Elian. "However," she continued, a glint of scientific zeal in her eyes, "your reaction was also a successful stress test of the psychic bond, a far more successful one than I could have designed. It confirms my hypothesis. The resonance is not a simple compatibility. It is a foundational, imperative bond, a primitive, protective instinct overriding years of conditioning." She leaned forward. "This makes you far too valuable to decommission, Executor. You and Subject 734 are the key to the next stage of the resonance program. You will continue your duties, but you are now under my direct and continuous observation. Consider yourself the primary variable in my experiment." He was dismissed. It was not a reprieve. It was a new, more elaborate cage. He walked from her office, the weight of her scrutiny a physical shroud. He was her lab rat. And Elian was the bait. Back in his cell, Elian felt the shift in their connection. The raw, open wound of their joining in the chamber had subsided, replaced by a quiet, steady link. It was no longer a source of pain, but a lifeline. He could feel Kale's presence, a steady point of gravity in the psychic chaos of the facility. He was back in his own quarters, wrestling with the implications of Thorne's new directive. Elian closed his eyes, focusing on the connection. He did not send a thought or a memory. He sent a feeling, gratitude, a simple, pure wave of it, a quiet thank you for the truth. He felt a flicker of surprise from Kale's end, followed by a wave of something dark and complex, guilt, frustration, and a fierce, burning protectiveness. It was a conversation without words, more honest than any spoken dialogue. They began to communicate. It was a dangerous, clandestine language woven from the threads of their bond. Kyle, with his intimate knowledge of the Concordance's systems, would send warnings. A flash of a guard's face who was known for his cruelty. A schematic of the ventilation system near Elian's cell, overlaid with the scent of ozone to indicate a coming chemical flush. A sudden, sharp feeling of urgency that meant Elian should feign sleep because an unscheduled inspection was imminent. Elian, in turn, would send back reassurances. The taste of bland, nutrient paste, to signify he had eaten. The sensation of calm, rhythmic breathing to show he was unharmed. These small, secret exchanges became their reality, a hidden world thriving in the cracks of the system's sterile facade. Fueled by a new, desperate purpose, Kale began to push the boundaries of his access. Late at night, when the system traffic was lowest, he sliced into the Concordance's deepest archives. He searched for the truth behind the resonance program. What he found chilled him to the bone. It was never about creating stable, harmonious pairs for society. That was a lie, a public-facing justification. The true purpose was control. The program was designed to identify high-resonance pairs to create psychic weapons. In most pairs, one mind was naturally dominant. The concordance would then amplify this dominance, conditioning the pair into a master-slave unit. The dominant partner would become a controller, able to puppeteer their resonant mate from a distance, using them as a perfect, untraceable tool for espionage or assassination. But the records also spoke of a rare, dangerous anomaly, a symmetrical bond. A pair with perfect 100% resonance where no natural dominance existed. A bond of equals. In every past case, these pairs had been deemed too unstable, too unpredictable. They had been decommissioned immediately upon discovery. He and Ilian were not just an experiment. They were a ghost, a statistical impossibility that the system, by its own rules, should have already erased. And Eris Thorne knew it. She wasn't just observing them. She was trying to figure out how to break the symmetry, how to turn one of them into the master and the other into the slave. The recalibration sessions continued, but they were different now. Ilian was no longer a passive victim enduring the system's attempts to grind him down. He had an anchor, a shield. The steady, silent presence of Kale at the other end of their bond was a fortress wall against which the neural shocks and psychic probes broke like waves against a cliff. He learned to draw on Kale's unshakable discipline to mirror his mental fortitude. The pain was still there, but it was distant, a storm raging on a far horizon. He was no longer drowning in it. He was learning to navigate it. This newfound resilience gave him the clarity to see his own abilities not as a curse, but as a tool. His empathy, his variance, was not a weakness. In a system built on the suppression of emotion, the ability to perceive it was a key that could unlock any door. He started to practice. It began as a defensive measure. During one session, a technician, frustrated by the lack of progress, prepared to administer a dangerously high-voltage neural shock. The man's mind was an open book of petty frustrations, a superior who belittled him, a low salary, a simmering resentment for his work. Ilian, instead of bracing for the pain, focused on that resentment. He didn't attack. He simply took the man's own toxic emotions and reflected them back at him, amplified 100-fold. The technician suddenly gasped, his hand flying to his chest. His face went pale, beaded with sweat. He stumbled back from the console, shaking his head, as if to clear it of a sudden, crippling migraine of self-loathing. I'm not well, he stammered, before turning and fleeing the room. The victory was small, silent, and invisible to any observer, but for Ilian, it was monumental. He was not just a receiver anymore, he could transmit. He was not a victim, he was a weapon. His confidence grew with each small success. He learned to skim the surface thoughts of the guards who patrolled his corridor. He learned their routines, their moments of distraction. He could feel the low-level anxiety of a technician responsible for the security grid in his sector. And through that anxiety, he could perceive the network itself. A web of light and data with nodes that flickered with weakness. His cell was no longer a cage, it was a training ground. He was honing his empathy into a scalpel, learning to dissect the minds of his captors, to find their fears and their failings. The system was a machine, and he was learning to hear the sounds of its grinding, breaking gears. Kyle felt the transformation through their bond. He felt Ilian's fear recede, replaced by a sharp, focused intent. He felt the flickers of Ilian's power, the subtle ways he was pushing back against his handlers. It was like watching a fledgling bird take flight, and it filled him with a terrifying, dangerous pride. He began to feed Ilian more than just warnings. He started sending information, complex data, cloaked in sensory metaphor. The layout of the recalibration ward was sent as a pattern of cool, smooth stones. The patrol routes of the executors became a rhythmic, pulsing beat. The master security codes for Sector Gamma were translated into a cascade of colors, a secret language only they understood. They were no longer just surviving. They were building a map. They were planning an escape. Overseer Eris Thorne was no fool. Her instruments tracked the change in Elian with cold, scientific precision. Subject 734's stress indicators were down. His cognitive functions were sharpening. His resistance to neural conditioning was reaching unprecedented levels. He was not breaking. He was healing. He was becoming stable, resilient, symmetrical. This was an unacceptable outcome. A balanced bond was a useless bond. It could not be controlled. It could not be weaponized. It was a beautiful, elegant, and utterly failed experiment. The variables had become self-aware. The time for observation was over. The time for dissection had begun. The anomaly had to be sterilized, its components analyzed separately. The bond had to be broken, permanently. The summons came at 2100 hours. Cull entered Overseer Thorne's office and stood at attention. The air was colder than usual, the faint scent of ozone sharper. Thorne was not at her desk. She stood before the large panoramic window that overlooked the Concordance's central plaza, a sterile landscape of white towers and perfectly manicured, joyless gardens. She did not turn to look at him. "The nature of a system, executor," she began, her voice a calm, philosophical murmur, "is to seek equilibrium. When a variance is introduced, the system will mobilize to correct it, to restore order. If it cannot be corrected, it must be purged." She finally turned, her slate-gray eyes pinning him in place. "The symmetrical bond you share with Subject 734 is such a variance. It is a fascinating, yet unproductive anomaly. It generates no hierarchy, no exploitable dominance. It is, from a functional standpoint, a failure." Kyle's blood ran cold. He kept his expression neutral, his posture rigid, but inside the protective instinct was a silent scream. "Subject 734 has reached the end of his diagnostic usefulness," Thorne stated, her voice devoid of any emotion. It was the tone of a scientist discussing a concluded experiment. "The bond has proven to be unilaterally symbiotic rather than hierarchically dominant. Therefore, the subject is scheduled for final decommissioning at 0400 hours. Decommissioning. The word was a sterile void, a cerebral wipe. They would scour his mind, erase his memories, his personality, his very self. They would leave behind a blank slate, a breathing, hollow shell. Elian would be gone, and only his body would remain. "You will oversee the procedure, executor," she added. "Your presence is required to monitor the severing of the psychic bond. The data will be invaluable." It was a final sadistic twist of the knife. He was not just to allow it to happen, he was to witness it, to participate in it. His perfect control, his lifetime of conditioning, held him in place. He gave a clipped single nod. "Understood, Overseer." The words felt like acid in his throat. He turned and walked from the office, each step a measured, controlled betrayal of the hurricane of violence building inside him. The facility he had served his entire life, the perfect, ordered system he had sworn to uphold, suddenly seemed like a monstrous, suffocating tomb. Every camera was a hostile eye. Every passing guard was an enemy. Every protocol was a bar on a cage. He had 7 hours. The instinct was no longer a whisper, it was a roaring, deafening imperative. Mine. Protect. Destroy them. He moved through the corridors, his mind a whirlwind of tactical analysis. Escape routes, security weaknesses, personnel rosters. He was the system's finest product, and he would use every piece of his training to tear it down from the inside. He reached out to Elian, not with a plan, not with words, but with a single, raw, overwhelming psychic scream. Danger. Run. Now. He pushed the image through their bond, a vision of the decommissioning chamber he had seen in the archives. A polished steel table, a halo of surgical lights, a bank of humming machines. The image was a promise of oblivion. In his cell, Elian received the warning like a physical blow. The terror was a paralyzing ice that flooded his veins. For a moment, he could not breathe. The image Cale sent was not just a picture, it was a feeling. The cold, sterile finality of erasure, but woven into the terror was Kyle's urgency, a white-hot current that burned away the paralysis. This was it. The end of the experiment. The end of them. Unless he moved. He rose from his cot, his mind racing. He could feel the two guards outside his cell, their thoughts lazy, bored. He reached out, not with a reflection of their own feelings, but with a targeted injection of pure, unadulterated panic. He found their deepest, most submerged anxieties. For one, it was the image of his child, pale and feverish, in a medical bed. For the other, the crushing weight of a gambling debt and the menacing face of a loan shark. He amplified these fears, twisted them into immediate, present threats. Outside the cell, the two guards suddenly stiffened. "Did you hear that?" one hissed, his eyes wide. "What was that alarm?" The other clutched his side. "It's my daughter. I just felt something's wrong." Their professionalism dissolved into raw, personal panic. They turned on each other, shouting, their voices rising in accusation and fear. In the ensuing chaos, Elian focused on the electronic lock of his cell door. He didn't understand the mechanics of it, but he could feel the technician who had installed it, the man's frustration at a faulty power regulator. Elian focused on that flaw, pushing a tiny, sharp pulse of psychic energy into it. The lock sparked, fizzled, and died. The door slid open an inch. He was out. The ghost in the machine was free. The concordance was a body, and Cale was its immune system turned rogue. He moved through the sterile arteries of the facility with a lethal grace, a shadow of purpose in a world of white. He was not an executor anymore. He was an engine of pure, focused intent. The objective was simple: dismantle the cage, retrieve what was his, and burn the rest to the ground. He started in the Sector Delta Armory. The two guards on duty saw him approach and stiffened to attention. "Executor," one began, but Cale was already moving. He used no weapon. His hands were faster, more precise, a strike to the throat, a nerve pinch to the shoulder. They were down, unconscious, before they could even raise an alarm. He equipped himself, a compact neural disruptor pistol, concussion grenades, a plasma-edged combat knife. He was not just escaping, he was going to war. As he worked, a silent mantra repeated in his mind, a final shedding of his old identity. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was not a number. Alarms began to blare across the facility, a chaotic, discordant symphony. But they were the wrong alarms, in the wrong sectors. From his hiding place in a EA maintenance duct, Elian was conducting the orchestra. He was the ghost in the machine, and he was turning the Concordance's central nervous system against itself. He reached out, touching the minds of the security hub operators, seeding them with confusion and paranoia. He sent them phantom images, fires in the lower levels, breaches in the outer perimeter. He made them hear whispers in their comms, distorted voices speaking of betrayal. The facility's response was immediate, massive, and directed entirely at threats that did not exist. Squads of executors were dispatched to empty corridors. Containment fields were erected around deserted labs. The sterile order of the Concordance collapsed into a panicked, flailing mess. Cale used the chaos as his cover. He moved toward the central server nexus, the heart of the facility, the one place from which Overseer Thorn could regain control. He knew Elian would be drawn there too. Their bond was a homing beacon, pulling them toward a single point of convergence. He found him in the antechamber to the Nexus core, a small figure in a white medical gown, barefoot and pale, but with an expression of fierce, focused concentration. Elian's eyes were closed, his hand pressed against the wall, feeding chaos directly into the system's data conduits. They did not need to speak. Kyle gave a slight nod. "I'm here." Elian's reply was a wave of relief and resolve. "I know." The doors to the Nexus core slid open. Inside, the air hummed with the power of 1,000 servers. And waiting for them was Overseer Eris Thorne. She was not alone. Two of her personal guard, elite executors in polished black armor, flanked her. She held a sleek silver neural disruptor in her hand, its barrel aimed steadily forward. Her face was a mask of calm academic interest. "A fascinating, if predictable, outcome," she said, her voice cutting through the hum of the machines. "The protective imperative overriding all conditioning. The flight or fight response manifesting as systemic sabotage. Your data will be invaluable to the next generation of the Resonance program." Kale stepped in front of Elian, shielding him with his body. "It's over, Thorne," he said, his voice a low growl. "Let him go." Thorne's smile was thin, chilling. "The experiment is only over when I have collected all the variables," she replied, and nodded to her guards. The fight was a blur of brutal efficiency. The two executors were good, products of the same relentless training as Kale. But Kale was fighting for something more than protocol. He was fighting for the only thing that had ever made him feel human. He moved like a phantom, his plasma knife a flicker of blue light in the cool darkness of the server room. He was not just deflecting and disabling, he was dismantling his own kind, piece by painful piece. While Kyle engaged the guards, Elian focused on Thorne. He did not attack her mind. It was too shielded, too disciplined. Instead, he attacked her environment. He reached out and touched the fragile, complex ecosystem of technology that surrounded them. He found the power regulators, the cooling fans, the data processors, and with a single focused push of his will, he broke them. The lights flickered violently, then died, plunging the Nexus into absolute darkness. The roar of the servers screamed to a high-pitched whine, then fell silent. He had ripped the heart out of the machine. In the sudden suffocating silence and dark, Thorne fired the disruptor. A flash of silver energy lit the room. Kale, tracking her movement by sound and instinct, shoved Elian hard to the side. The blast caught him high on the shoulder. The pain was excruciating, a white-hot fire that seared through his nerves and made his arm go numb. He stumbled but did not fall. He lunged forward in the darkness, his hand finding Thorne's wrist, twisting it with surgical precision until he heard the clatter of the disruptor on the floor. The fight was over. The facility was blind, deaf, and in chaos. They had a window. Kyle grabbed Elian's hand, his grip tight, and pulled him toward a maintenance hatch he knew was hidden behind a server bank. Now he grunted, the pain in his shoulder making his voice strained. Together they plunged into the darkness below, leaving the ruins of their prison behind them. The maintenance tunnels were a different world. The air, for the first time, was not sterile. It was damp and heavy, thick with the smell of old metal, lubricant, and decay. The perfect, seamless white of the facility above gave way to rough-hewn concrete and bundles of thick, dusty cables. The only light came from Kale's tactical illuminator, a narrow dancing beam that cut through the oppressive darkness. Kyle led the way, his steps sure and certain, despite the searing pain in his shoulder. He had memorized the schematics, the labyrinthine underbelly of the Concordance, as part of his executor training. He never imagined he would use that knowledge for this. Elian followed close behind, his hand still held in Kale's. The grip was a grounding force in the disorienting dark, a physical confirmation that this was real, that they were moving towards something other than a cell or an execution chamber. They moved in silence for what felt like hours, descending deeper into the guts of the machine. The sounds of the chaos above faded, replaced by the drip of unseen water and the low hum of subterranean power conduits. Finally, Cale stopped at a large circular hatch, sealed with a rusted locking wheel. "This leads to the old aqueduct system," he said, his voice strained. "It was decommissioned decades ago. It should take us beyond the perimeter." It took all his remaining strength, his good arm straining to turn the wheel. With a groan of protesting metal, the hatch swung open, revealing a gaping black maw that smelled of wet earth and rain. They climbed out, emerging not into the sterile, controlled environment of the Concordance, but into the raw, untamed night. Rain was falling. Not the recycled, purified water of the facility's atmospheric showers, but real, cold, natural rain. It plastered Elian's thin medical gown to his skin, slicked Cale's ash-blonde hair to his scalp. The sensation was so alien, so overwhelming, that Elian stopped and simply tilted his head back, letting the drops strike his face. It was the first weather he had felt since he was a small child, before he had been taken into the Institute. Cale watched him, the hard lines of his face softened by the dim light and the falling rain. The pain in his shoulder was a raging fire, the neural disruptor's energy still coursing through his system. But for a moment, he forgot it. They were out. They were free. The exertion had taken its toll. Kyle stumbled, his legs finally giving out. The neural injury was catching up to him. Elian rushed to his side, helping him into the shelter of a nearby ruin, the crumbling remains of an old transit station, its roof long since collapsed, its walls covered in ivy. Kyle slumped against a graffiti-covered wall, his breathing ragged. Elian, acting on pure instinct, tore a long strip from the hem of his gown. The fabric was flimsy, but it was all he had. He gently pushed aside the torn fabric of Kyle's uniform to examine the wound. The skin was burned, an angry red web of energy marks spreading from a central point. "You are injured," Elian said, his voice rough with disuse and emotion. It was the first thing he had said aloud to Kyle since the assessment. "It is functional," Kyle breathed, his eyes clenched shut against a wave of pain. Elian's hands, surprisingly steady, began to clean the wound with the rain-soaked cloth. His touch was gentle, hesitant, a stark contrast to the rough handling of the medics. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of the rain drumming on the broken concrete around them. "Why?" Elian asked finally, his voice barely a whisper. The single word was freighted with the weight of weeks of pain and confusion. "The rejection." Kyle opened his eyes. They were filled with a deep, weary pain. "In the Concordance," he said, his voice low and hoarse, "to be seen as a matched pair is to be seen as a weapon. To be analyzed, controlled, and weaponized, but to be seen as a flaw, a variance, is to be hidden, forgotten." He looked at Elian, the truth a raw, open wound between them. "I chose to hide you, inefficiently." The bitter irony hung in the air. His attempt to hide Elian had put him directly in Thorne's spotlight, turning him from a forgotten file into her pet project. His logic had been flawless, and his conclusion had been catastrophically wrong. As the pre-dawn light began to filter through the gray, weeping clouds, it illuminated the small, sheltered space. It caught the dust motes dancing in the air, the sheen of rain on their skin, the exhaustion and pain etched onto their faces. They were wounded, hunted, with the entire force of the Concordance undoubtedly mobilizing to find them. But they were together, and they were free. Kyle raised his good hand, the movement slow, deliberate. He reached for Elian, his fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second, a lifetime of conditioning warring with a single, simple need. Then his fingertips brushed against Elian's cheek. The touch was not psychic. It was real. Skin on skin. It was tentative, questioning, yet it held the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. It was a promise. In the ruins of the old world, surrounded by the gentle, cleansing rain, it was the beginning of a new one.